Hey, Randy Joe here, and this is 1001 Reviews, the series where I plan on reviewing every single album from the 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die book. And today we are looking at the Chemical Brothers' 1997 album, Dig Your Own Hole. The Chemical Brothers released Dig Your Own Hole underneath the Virgin label, produced by the Chemical Brothers themselves with art direction from Negative Space, nationality UK, and a running time of 63 minutes and 19 seconds. Now, electronic music for me is not necessarily the greatest of genres personally. I find it very difficult to get into electronic music, and the electronic music I tend to gravitate towards is a lot more modern or things that came out past the 2000s. Personally, I find that the older the electronic music is, the more dated it tends to feel, and Dig Your Own Hole is a pretty good example of that, as most of this album feels pretty dated already. Coming out in 1997, Dig Your Own Hole is an album stemming from the subgenre known as big beat, which was a pretty popular genre for electronic music from the mid-90s to early 2000s, and it was rather short-lived. However, there were quite a few albums to rise to the top out of this genre. What big beat was known most for was using heavy uses of breakbeats as well as synthesized loops to create a much more heavy and fast tempo sort of electronic style, kind of resembling the genre known as acid house. However, I feel like this album really only proves that big beat was a short-lived subgenre for a reason. It really doesn't have that much variety or that much oomph to it to really carry on for much longer than it did. However, it's not to say that this album overall is that weak of an effort. There are definitely some highlight tracks here. For example, the opening track, Block, Rockin' Beats, does really kick things off into a really up-tempo and luscious sort of produced track that feels incredibly infectious and draws you in quite strongly and really fuses together the big beat electronic genres and shows you just the overall aesthetic that is being captured here. You get the concept behind the genre pretty quick from this track alone, and it is definitely the greatest or catchiest track on here and is definitely worth the listen. But unfortunately, this opening track really does show off, I think, the best talents of the Chemical Brothers on this album, as this is definitely the most catchy of the bunch. There's a reason why this is the most popular track on the album, because it is definitely the most enjoyable track from the album. For the most part, a lot of the other tracks on here feel like much weaker versions of this opening track and really just feel like an extension of big beat done to a lesser effect. There are a few other tracks I do enjoy on here. For example, the fourth track, Piku, has a much darker tone, and with that has a bit more of an oomph and really stands out as a great use of repetition, as this track carries itself quite strongly through these repeating beats that feel almost ominous and dark in tone. The overall style of this one is a great detour from a lot of the other big beat tracks on here, and in doing so feels like a unique standout track that is definitely doing a bit more than what else this album has to offer. The last two tracks, Where Do I Begin and the Private Psychedelic Reel, are also pretty great, with one fusing right into the next to create almost a 16-minute track of sorts that does feel like it has a much more varying degree of switch-ups in tones and styles. The Psychedelic Reel especially definitely feels like a really fantastic 9-minute track that doesn't meander around too long or become too stale in its own merits. But I feel like these tracks that I've already mentioned here are kind of the gist of this album that doesn't feel that dated. The rest of this thing does feel like something that stems straight from the 90s, from everything about it to the repetitive nature of big beat and the overall almost cheesy and corny style as well of big beat just feels like it stems straight from that era, and in doing so doesn't really feel like it's that much of a standout album. I think my issue is that I am constantly listening to this thing and comparing it to the electronic music that I've already heard in this modern day, and I feel like this is only a stepping stone to get to the good stuff that would come out in the mid-2000s onwards. Because to be quite honest, I feel like electronic music has only gotten good around that point forward, and everything before then just feels like quite bland, generic dance music that is really only made to play at the clubs. And that's not to say that there's not a purpose for it, there's not a reason for it, but I do think that carrying on an album, especially one at this length, at over an hour long, feels like it is almost meandering around for way too long and really doesn't have the strength to carry its own weight, as it is far too grand in runtime to really justify it, to be quite honest with you. And on top of that, as far as the big beat genre goes, there are also quite a few other albums in this book that cover that genre to a better extent. For example, the Chemical Brothers also has their debut in here, and there's also the Fatboy Slim album, and even a couple of Prodigy albums as well, the godfathers, one might say, of big beat. And all these albums came before the 1997 release of Dig Your Own Hole. So with that being said, this album that really meanders around for over an hour in length, does it really justify a place in the book, and does it really do or say anything with the big beat genre that these prior albums have not already been done and said? And I guess at the end of the day, that would be just a matter of taste, but even still, I personally would much rather listen to something from Fatboy Slim over most of what I've heard on this album, because I do find this album to be overall pretty one note, pretty generic, and not something that I feel I have to really go back to. So the soft rating for me came to a 7.1, but I will harden that rating down to a 6.5 out of 10. And with that, obviously with all the negatives that I feel like this album really has going for it, without the few standout tracks to carry a bit of this album, I would go ahead and say that this is a not essential album. So it gets an NE for not essential. Anyways, that pretty much does it for this review. Let's go ahead and see what the next album we're listening to is in the 1001 albums to listen to before you die book. All right, random number generator, 1 to 1001, generate 63. We're listening to album number 63, which will be 63 being the Byrds' Fifth Dimension. So go ahead and listen to the Byrds' Fifth Dimension. I'll review that in exactly 1 week from now. That pretty much does it for this video. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe if you want to follow along and listen to every album from the 1001 albums to listen to before you die book. And as always, my name is Randy Joe, and I am signing off.